Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's Flame Connections webinar. I'm Aparna Shankar, Professor of Psychology at Flame. The Flame University Connections webinars are aimed at promoting interdisciplinary thinking and dialogue as we navigate the uncertainties that are thrown up by this COVID-19 crisis. Our webinar today explores isolation and social distancing in the times of COVID-19. I'd like to start off by introducing our panelists. We have two panelists today, Sabah Siddiqui and Patwardhan. Sabah Siddiqui is Assistant Professor of Psychology at Flame. Her recent research has focused on faith healing, where she investigates how medical sciences and traditional or alternative forms of medicine intersect in mental health service provision. Sabah is also a trained psychodynamic psychotherapist. Our second panelist is Patwardhan, who is also from psychology, who's also an assistant professor of psychology at Flame. Ninad's research is focused on autobiographical memory and its implications for well-being. He's primarily interested in the domains of social and personality psychology, cognitive science, health, and well-being. Just to give you a bit of background on the structure of today's webinar, so each of our panelists will speak for about 20 minutes. We'll follow this up with a question and answer session. So if you have any questions while you sort of listen to them, go through their presentations, please add this to the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom of your screen, and they'll take your questions at the end. Okay. I'd also like you to remember that this webinar is being recorded and the slides that our panelists present will be shared at the end. Okay. Thank you very much. And I'd like to invite Sabah to start, please. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. I will be talking about, like, within the structure of this webinar, I'll be talking about social distancing and the need for attachment. So at the beginning of 2020, we could not have predicted where we would find ourselves in 6 months. The COVID-19 pandemic has raged through the world and brought most of the world, especially the industrial world, to a standstill. So in this webinar, I and my co-panelist, Patwardhan, would like to take stock of the present circumstances and speculate on the likely psychological implications of the isolation and distancing actions being performed in the current pandemic. So what we have seen is that the medical crisis has necessitated swift measures. Most national governments have ordered lockdowns and asked citizens to confine themselves inside their houses and limit contact with the outside world. Practicing hand hygiene and social distancing were the earliest medical advice provided to us. And while hand hygiene has stood the test of time, the term social distancing has been replaced with physical distancing. However, I find the term social distancing quite interesting. So where does it come from? And what's the problem with it? It would seem that the term social distance was coined by Edward Hall in 1963 to develop a theory of proxemics within cultural anthropology. Here, in his theory, he delineated 4 zones of space between individuals: intimate space, less than half a meter; personal distance, about 1 meter; social distance, 2 to 3 meters; and public distance, more than 5 meters. So when does the term social distancing get popular? Or when does the term social distance get popular? I don't think it ever did. At least not with the frequency of use we hear today. What we hear today is social distancing, its verb form. We see its use start and escalate with the spread of the viral epidemic of SARS in 2003. Although it is difficult to still pinpoint who popularized the term during that time. Now, what we see here is a discursive shift in the move from social distance to social distancing, from a way of categorizing space between individuals to an action that must be performed with dubious medical sanction. So what we see is that the WHO steps in March 2020 to replace the common use of social distancing with physical distancing, along with the clarification that while keeping physical distance is essential to limiting the spread of COVID-19, the term social distancing seems to imply disconnection with people, even with loved ones. Nonetheless, I think the damage has been done. The effort of maintaining a safe distance from other people has become common and stressful. We can observe people in the crowded cities of India trying to follow physical distancing guidelines, but managing to perform the more anxiety-laden function of social distancing. So let's take a step back and look at what is at stake in performing this pandemic-related form of social distancing. Now, if we were to look towards the discipline of psychology, especially developmental psychology, which studies the physical, cognitive, and emotional development of the individual over time, a starting point could be the first year of life itself, through the attachment theory developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. Starting with his wartime experiences in World War II, Bowlby starts writing a theory about how the infant bonds with the caregiver or the attachment figure who looks after the needs and wants of this new person. Proximity to the attachment figure is essential for the survival of the infant, but there are long-term consequences of the kind and quality of care it receives from the environment, from the attachment figure. According to the models of attachment developed by Ainsworth, early attachment styles can predict later forms of relating in children and even in adults. Now, of course, this has been both critiqued and criticized. What I take from attachment theory, therefore, is that relating to the other is key to the development of the individual. We develop bonds with attachment figures and transfer those forms of relating to people further afield. Children, through play and schooling, explore the ways in which they must relate and connect with people outside the family unit. So what is of interest here is individuation, the ability to differentiate oneself from others. And here I'd like to stress individuation from attachment figures from the family. By the teenage years, adolescents are pushing to express individuality and often are caught in oppositional stances against those around them, from people who hold power over them. In developmental psychology, this is an extremely important experience for adolescents. And the need to develop an identity that is differentiated from others is as much as a need to express personal individuality as it is to seek connection with others, to reconfigure relating to the other with the early demand for a more equitable sharing of power. By the late teens, in the very constituency of young adults we see here in our students in Flame University, well-rounded development of the individual requires meeting with more diverse kinds of people, with experiencing difference, even by being challenged by alterity. This is ensured for this constituency, marked by particular socioeconomic classes in the experience of higher education in the university. For young adults, it is contact with difference that spurs development through the building of intellectual, social, and sexual relations. So the college experience provides one platform for these meetings, and learning happens as much in discussion and debate with teachers and mentors as it happens in conversation and disagreement with friends and peers. Thus, we have to wonder what happens in the form of this contact, if the form of this contact is changed to an online platform suddenly, if the opportunity to facing up to difference is withdrawn from the face-to-face contact present in the university experience. In the COVID-19 pandemic, we must take stock of the psychological consequences of remote learning experience. The flexibility offered by online classes, even its ability to be deployed and managed in crisis situations, such as what confronted us in March 2020, must be evaluated and analyzed as we learn to manage the medical crisis around us. Here is a question on the meaning and process of education. Pedagogy is more than the transfer of knowledge, more than the downloading of data that the World Wide Web allows us to do. While access to online education has opened up the field of knowledge in ways unimaginable a few decades back, we need to interrogate what this form of pedagogy is doing to us and our students. If we look at psychological theory, we could ask, how much is proximity to other people significant for intellectual development in young adults? What are the psychological effects of physical distance, of maintaining it? And to recenter the premise of my talk, the psychological effects of social distancing. How do we ensure that distance does not create social isolation for remote learning students? The larger question is the effect of practicing self-isolation, home quarantine, and physical distancing by the general population. Now, the effects of social isolation have been studied in circumstances vastly different from the present-day epidemic. But they tell us about the physical and mental health effects of isolation and loneliness. Our host, Professor Aparna Shankar, has herself done extensive studies on this topic. Isolation has psychosomatic effects on health, and 3 months of lockdown that we have observed here in India will have psychological consequences that we are not yet aware of. I believe Ninad will look at these effects more closely. However, our analysis here are speculations. It is early days yet. We are only beginning to emerge from months of government-mandated lockdown, and many of us continue to self-isolate with the dangers of infection still looming around us. Without a viable evidence-based cure or even treatment of COVID-19, there is some uncertainty about venturing out and coming in contact with others, with strangers, those who live and work outside our gated communities. There is a great deal of speculation what the post-COVID new normal will look like. It would be problematic to think that the risk the other poses to our health and well-being is new in the circumstances of the current pandemic. The other has always been a risk, an acknowledged danger to the feelings of a defined and coherent sense of the self. The other has always brought this narcissistic unity of the self not only to question, but to the threat of annihilation. The other carries the risk of infection, of transmitting the knowledge of the other that can invade and weaken the certainties of our own body of knowledge. We have acknowledged this risk and we have developed many ways. Just a moment. We have acknowledged this risk and have developed many ways to keep the other at a distance. In South Asia, we have the caste system. Globally and across time, we have the class wars and are witnessing a growing chasm between the haves and the have-nots. We have kept women under parda, out of view and out of power. We have policed the budding sexuality of young people. We have stigmatized non-normative sexualities and genders. We have divided ourselves with borders of bombs and barbed wires. We have made entry and access difficult for international migrants and refugees with visas, immigration rules, and citizenship laws. We have hindered the flow of knowledge from the global north to the global south. In fact, we have always practiced social distancing. So post-COVID, we are going to see a new normal, but we must ask what is new about it, as well as what is the new that we want to see. So what we have here is an opportunity. The pandemic has provided us with a freeze frame, a slice of time where the social realities of the world before the birth of this virus are not only replicated in this moment, but magnified. We see the inequalities of class, caste, race, indigeneity, gender, sexuality, and environmental degradation writ large while we battle the coronavirus, just as time has slowed down in the lockdown. Presented by a psychological analysis here now is a conception of what it means to be human, that in relating, in creating social bonds, networks, and solidarities, in the dialectics of the self and the other is a psychological conception of being human. Relating to the other, to difference, to alterity, is the psychological expression of the proper development of the individual, the full potential of which we have not yet, the full potential of which we have yet not witnessed, as we have always practiced social distancing. Distance from each other, both consciously and unconsciously, due to the social structures of the reality we currently inhabit. We have not yet seen the full potential of what it means to be human. Thus, what psychological theory demonstrates is that human beings are relational beings, not only for survival, but for development. That we are drawn to creating bonds and seeking connections, and that must take us further away from the spaces of comfort and familiarity to the encounter with a radically different other. Now, as I conclude, I offer the inspiration of a global fight against another pandemic, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, the epidemic that raged through the world in the 1990s. The presence of the new illness then, was detected only in the early 1980s, especially among populations of gay men. In the early days, it was actually termed GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency, before the shift to HIV, or human immunodeficiency virus. In associating HIV with homosexuality, a stigma around the virus grew to toxic proportions, and moral and political posturing hampered the scientific treatment of the illness. In that man-made tragedy, we lost so many people in the prime of their lives that it has been called the lost generation. Over time, medical practitioners found ways to limit the spread of the virus and treat the symptoms even after contracting AIDS. If moralizing the problems for HIV/AIDS as a punishment from God against sex, especially homosexuality, health initiatives saw a widespread use of safe sexual practices, needle exchange programs, and antiretroviral therapy as scientific methods to treat a public health menace. In March 2020, a Lancet report locates the case of the second person to be cured of HIV-1. This is just the report of one case, but a breakthrough that was inconceivable 30 years back. There is much work to be done in backing up this one case, till we find a mass cure for HIV/AIDS. And a lot of non-COVID work has been deprioritized as the urgency for the cure, for finding a way to manage COVID-19, a cure has taken center stage. However, it should provide us with the inspiration that a science-based approach can get through not only the HIV epidemic, but also the COVID pandemic. Alongside the medical crisis rages a social crisis that hampers the development of both science and society. So again, once again, to take forward the rallying cry from the lost pandemic, be positive. Thank you. I think we'll be taking questions after Minad's talk, right, Aparna?
Yes, that's right. Thank you very much, Sabah. That was really interesting. And thank you all for the questions that you have on the chat. We're making a note of these and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. As in when I say we, I mean the panelists, obviously. We'll do their best to answer all that they can at the end once Ninad has finished his talk as well. So thanks once again, Sabah. Ninad, if you'd like to start your talk, please, that'd be great. Ninad, you're on mute. I think you just need to unmute yourself, please.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Aparna, for the wonderful introduction. And thanks, Sabah, for coming up with interesting insights about the attachment perspective, especially in the context of COVID-19 situation. In today's talk, I'm going to carry forward from what Sabah has talked about, and I will focus on another interesting consequence which I think is associated with COVID-19 situation, and that is alienation. So of course, when you look at social distancing as a concept, right, it is a concept that is controversial in its own ways, because although it was supposed to indicate physical distancing, but also like it carried a negative connotation. So when we talk about social distancing, it in fact has led to negative consequences such as depression, and it can lead to these consequences such as depression and anxiety. One variable which I think mediates the association between social distancing and well-being is alienation. So when you talk about the concept of alienation, it essentially refers to a sense of disconnectedness from the self and even from the activities one engages in. So when we look at the concept of alienation, initially it was looked at more from a sociological perspective. For example, I'm sure you must have heard of Karl Marx, who talked about alienation as a situation where a worker is separated from the output he or she generates, right? But when we talk about social psychological perspective on alienation, we have to refer to work by Melvin Seaman, or Seaman, who talks about alienation as consisting of 6 components, namely powerlessness, normlessness, meaninglessness, cultural estrangement, self-estrangement, and social isolation. So when we talk about powerlessness, we are talking about the inability to exert control over the outcomes. Okay, so in a way, individuals who find themselves powerless are typically low on internal locus of control. So when in psychology, we also talk about the distinction between two concepts, namely agency and fatalism. So when we are referring to agency, it essentially means autonomy, achievement, and a sense of mastery, which exactly is something which individuals who are uh, high on powerlessness do not typically possess. So they are more typically fatalists. In other words, they see events as being predetermined. Other concept is that of meaninglessness, which essentially refers to the inability to make sense of events that are taking place around you. Okay. The third concept is normlessness, which essentially refers to use of socially inappropriate methods to achieve goals. Okay. Uh, the fourth concept is that of self-estrangement, which is about not being able to yeah.
Ninad, your audio is breaking up a little bit. Could you please adjust?
Yeah.
Hello, Ninad?
Yeah, is it better?
Slightly better. You're breaking up a little bit.
Okay, so when we are talking about, yeah, I'll just log in using my phone. I think that's
okay. That'd be great. Could you just, to all the attendees, Ninad is just going to try logging in once again. So if you could just wait, please, that'd be really helpful. As we wait for Ninad, Sabah, do you have a second to answer one of the questions that came up, asking for some clarification regarding one of the concepts that you mentioned in your talk? So maybe you could just clarify that, and that might sort of help with some sort of further discussions later on. So one of the things you mentioned was you talked about dialectics of the self and the psychological concept of being human. And one of our attendees would just like some clarification on what exactly you sort of mean or what this might encompass. If you could help with that, please.
Right. So when I say the dialectics of the self and the other, it is that like starting with attachment theory, but a lot of other psychological and psychoanalytic theory, there is no way of developing a sense of self without developing a relation to the other. So, and as I said, the other also comes with risk. So there is also the, like, I mean, in the danger of the other also creates a sense of, a sense of self. And so there is also the question of how power intervenes in the creation of this, in the creation of the ways in which the self and the other will relate to each other. And if I was to go a little more into the attachment theory here, it would be that while children or the infant make like bond with the attachment figure for the sake of survival. They also do it for the psychological need of security. In the answer that they get from the environment, from the attachment figure, they learn a certain kind of lesson, right? And then they transfer those lessons onwards. So I think like this is a process then that in attachment theory, then that continues for the rest of your life. And every change in the self would also require an understanding of the other that has changed, that has differentiated. So I think that would be what I was meaning by the dialectics of the self and the other.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Sabah. I don't know when Anad is. Are you happy to take another question in the interim? Thank you. That's really kind. So one of the things that you talked about that was really quite interesting is how we've always, to some extent, practiced social distancing, right? We've always found ways to kind of other people. And this might just be yet another one. So do you have any thoughts on how social distancing might aggravate sort of existing norms of otherness? So this is Dr. Rusha from JNU, and how social spaces might be more or less dominated by sort of, I think Dr. Rusha talks about men. So, you know, how they might be more dominated by men and therefore become more unsafe for women.
Yes, so I think, yes, I said that social distancing is something we've been practicing before. But what happens in the present situation, in these circumstances, is that what used to be there is magnified. So actually, we have seen how the reports of domestic violence and sexual violence and child sexual abuse have increased in this time. So in a way, the way I've been thinking is that actually the pandemic has given us like this, in this mirror into what happens generally, and that has become intensified. We will need to develop new mechanisms about how to handle the new threats that have come, especially I think through a huge use of online media, where we don't have a lot of ways of regulating contact, of regulating even professional relations, of social relations. That is, I think, a budding field. I think that especially for women, we will need to create new guidelines there as to what is appropriate, what is appropriate contact or not. Sure. Of course, in physical spaces, such that the whole, like the rise of domestic violence, sexual violence. I think there's something about, having to come to the end of these lockdowns to come together, to recuperate, and to find ways of starting the fight again, intensified.
Sort of recalibrate almost, yes. Yeah. Great. Thank you very much, Sabah. Ninad's back on. So thanks so much for filling in for a bit. Ninad, thank you for coming back, and you can continue. Great.
Thanks, Aparna. And thanks, Sabah, for bringing in some really interesting insights. So I was talking about this whole concept of social distancing, which according to CDC involves remaining out of congregate settings, avoiding mass gatherings, and maintaining distance approximately 6 feet or 2 meters from others as and when possible, right? Now, in fact, in March 2020, WHO in fact suggested that the term social distancing should in fact not be used, but we should talk about what is called physical distancing, right? So in fact, social distancing, if we are to practice it, it can lead to mental health conditions such as anxiety and depression. Now, if you were to think about it, in 2017, ICMR study indicates that nearly 197.3 million people had mental conditions, out of which nearly 45.7 people in fact were suffering from depressive disorders, and 44.9 million people were in fact having anxiety disorders. So just think about social distancing and the impact that it can have on the mental health of people, and I'm sure the situation is likely to worsen in the days to come, right? So in fact, if we were to think about a factor that which could explain why social distancing could lead to anxiety or depression, I think one factor that I would strongly focus on is a sense of alienation. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so when we talk about alienation, it is a feeling and a fact of being disconnected from people and activities, right? Now, alienation as a concept initially received a lot of interest in sociological perspective. So for instance, when you think about Karl Marx, he talked about alienation as a situation that arises when a worker feels separated from the output he or she generates, right? But later, social psychological literature also started focusing on different facets of alienation. The first facet is what is called powerlessness, which typically reflects the inability to exert control over circumstances. So typically individuals who are high on powerlessness also are low on what is called internal locus of control. So they typically see themselves as being the victim of circumstances. The second dimension is that of meaninglessness, which refers to the tendency or inability to not make sense of what is going around, right? And the third dimension of alienation is a sense of normlessness, which involves using socially inappropriate means to achieve certain goals and outcomes, right? The fourth dimension of alienation is a sense of self-estrangement, in which an individual is actually out of touch with himself or herself. So there is a loss of authenticity. Also, like an individual engages in activities which he or she does not find intrinsically challenging, okay? The fifth dimension is cultural estrangement, which typically refers to the tendency to distance oneself from shared cultural values and sociocultural norms. And the last factor is social isolation, which typically reflects the extent of exclusion or being accepted by the group and the society in which one lives. So in today's presentation, I'm going to primarily focus on social isolation. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So when we talk about social isolation, of course, sociology has a very different way of looking at social isolation, but in psychology, social isolation primarily involves two components. There's one objective component which is evident in social connectedness, and subjective component is perceived isolation. So when we talk about social connectedness, we are talking about the size of one's social network and the number of people one interacts with and the amount of interactions that one engages in. But when we talk about perceived isolation, we are talking about how an individual evaluates the quality of his or her social relationships. All right. So when we talk about social isolation and loneliness, it can have a devastating impact on an individual, and it in fact can lead to like exacerbate depressive symptoms and also is predictive of mortality. And in fact, this association in fact is a lot more problematic, especially for the elderly, because especially like now we think about COVID-19 times, of course the elderly are the most vulnerable in terms of like suffering from severe illness, right? But at the same time, they're also facing extensive social isolation, right? Next slide, please. Yes. So, of course, when we talk about social isolation, we need to also understand the factors that are leading to social isolation, right? Now, of course, when we talk about the 21st century, we are living in an era of technology, which has brought the world closer, but families have been pulled apart. So, of course, you may end up seeing situations where, for example, maybe in your family, you're interacting with someone who's like in Los Angeles, maybe your brother or sister is interacting with someone who's in Sydney, but you and your sibling are not interacting with each other. Okay. So this in fact is one factor that this trend is something which continues even in the present, right? Also what we see happening is that there's over reliance on text-based interactions, especially like using WhatsApp, Twitter. So what happens when you're using these text-based apps is that there is limited access to non-verbal cues such as facial expressions and even body movements. Now, although we have like WhatsApp call, we have like Zoom and even WebEx through which we can get some access to visual and auditory cues, but again, the access is relatively limited as compared to when we engage in face-to-face interactions, right? Now, also what one non-verbal cue that is missing, especially in virtual communications, is interpersonal touch. Like now when we talk about distancing, right, people are avoiding any form of interpersonal touch as much as they can. And when we talk about interpersonal touch, it is a non-verbal cue that elicits warmth, comfort, and nurturance, right? Also, what is happening here is that with uh, social distancing norms in place, many governments have imposed restrictions on collective events. So the moment these restrictions are in, right, when you're not, when you're a part of the collective, typically you experience what is called a collective effervescence. So for example, when you're a part of group and when you're interacting with them, maybe for example over topics over which you bond, it creates a sense of emotional contagion. But now with restrictions coming in, where is the opportunity to have a sense of collective effervescence, right? Next slide, please. Yes. So the question that now arises is that, of course, we are facing social isolation and in COVID-19 times. So what exactly is it that we can do to foster social connectedness and reduce social isolation in these times? One important thing that we can definitely engage in is pro-social behavior. Help someone who is in need. Could be the elderly, could be the people who are underprivileged. If you see, for example, what is happening these days is that I've seen in many families that the decision has been made, for example, not to pay the maid for the months that she has not come to work, right? But think about it, that you are able to run your affairs smoothly because of their presence. So it's important to acknowledge the contributions that they make, and it's important to even like reinforce them in whatever capacity you can, so that it maintains a sense of social connectedness, because you eventually do need them at some point in time, right? Other important thing is to stay connected with family members, right? Find time to get together, do activities which really like bring in a sense of joy. Could be like singing, being a part of karaoke experience, or could be like even like coming together to cook meals, right? Those are the avenues through which the family can get connected, right? But let's say, for example, if you're not staying with your family, but you're staying maybe alone, right? Technology is there to our rescue, right? So in fact, technology especially can play a very critical role in staying connected with family members, close friends, and even relatives, okay? The third important aspect is to express gratitude. It's important to acknowledge the contributions that people have made to help you become who you are as a person. Now, when we talk about gratitude, it is a factor which has been found to be critical in fostering social connectedness. So I'm going to go to a very interesting theory, which is called the broaden and build theory of positive emotions, which was proposed by Barbara Fredrickson. So what she's saying is that expression of positive emotions, in fact, expand one's repertoire of social resources, which in turn enhances well-being. The next way in which we can foster social connectedness is through active listening. Okay, when I'm talking about active listening, it's important to immerse yourself in the conversation that you are a part of. And that is something which can strengthen and even improve intimacy in relationships, right? And the last dimension which I'm going to talk about is the use of symbolic social ties. Now, of course, we do have like in actual social bonds, maybe with our parents, with our friends, right? But there are some bonds which are imaginary. So even having those imaginary bonds actually can foster a sense of connectedness and reduce isolation. So one of them being comfort food, right? So when we think about like, it could be like preparing meals and sharing the photos of what you've prepared on Instagram or any social networking site, or even like consuming comfort food, could be like rajma chawal, idli chutney, etc. Right? Now these comfort foods typically evoke a sense of warmth and care, and this is something which helps us actually foster a sense of social connectedness. Even when we talk about reading books, they can play a very, very critical role in fostering social connectedness. So there is one hypothesis which is called the normative collective assimilation hypothesis, which talks about the fact that when you immerse yourself in an experience, you automatically become a part of the group of characters that you are immersing yourself in. So if you think about reading fiction, it has been found to play a very critical role in enhancing empathy, right? And the last symbolic social tie that I'm going to talk about is parasocial connection. Now, when I talk about a parasocial connection, it is like an illusory connection, a connection that you believe you have with someone else, but that person is not aware about it. So it's like a one-sided connection that you have. Could be like with a celebrity, could be with a famous figure. So in fact, having those parasocial connections has been found to play again a very, very critical role in fostering a sense of connectedness, right? So I think to sum up what I have said, yes, social isolation can arise in times like these. But remember one thing, I would like to bring in a famous quote by Milan Kundera. What he's saying is that the worth of an individual lies in the ability to go beyond oneself and exist in and for other people. So stay connected and all the best. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Nanad. And I think both Nanad and Sabah put forward sort of some really interesting ideas, and we've had some great questions as well. Sabah's already taken a couple of questions, but I'm going to pose a few more that have been asked by our attendees. So one of the things that Ninad, you sort of touched on a little bit briefly, as did you, Sabah, but maybe you'd like to elaborate on. So we're already here in India in lockdown. I mean, in various parts of India, obviously it's different, but we've sort of been experiencing lockdown for several months now. It's been over 3 months or so. What do you think might be the effects of these the sort of long-term effects of this kind of prolonged isolation? Obviously, Ninad, you're muted again. Obviously, I realize we don't have a lot of these answers. Do we have anything sort of similar that we might be able to draw on? Are you seeing? I mean, Sabah, I don't know if you're currently practicing, but have you sort of, or in conversations maybe with other practicing therapists, come across certain things that you think might be, especially from a sort of mental health viewpoint, things that might be particularly problematic at this time and might emerge over prolonged periods of lockdown?
Nath, you were speaking. Would you like to take this?
Yeah. So in fact, given that we are in the lockdown for quite some time, I think the impact on, I personally see we are staring at an imminent mental health crisis. So we are going to see a lot of cases of depression and anxiety coming up. And I don't think we have enough manpower to deal with the challenges that we're going to encounter in the days to come. So we do need a lot of mental health interventions in place to deal with the imminent challenges.
Okay, Sabah, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think one thing is what we're going to see is a lot of behaviors that are risky, like are risky to health. Like for instance, the pandemic is not yet over, and we don't know when it is going to be. We actually are going to require a lot more patience and a lot more fortitude. In like trying to see where this pandemic goes. So I think one of our challenges is to kind of hold strong, through this period. So one thing is that we're going to see some of those, behaviors that are not actually healthy for us or are, risky for us. And then of course, the effects of a prolonged isolation, even like a fear of the outside, a fear of going outside, meeting new people is going to have significant effects on our mental health. I think actually for the effects of what loneliness does, I think you're somebody who would be able to talk, perhaps bring better data than we can at this point.
We could potentially talk. I mean, I'd really like to sort of focus on what you guys have covered, but maybe sort of also related to what you were just saying, Ninad, I know you sort of brought up some suggestions on how we might be able to sort of deal with, or might be able to sort of weather this, sort of build up some resilience over time to the sort of negative effects of prolonged isolation. So I have a couple of questions from a couple of different people. So one talks about, do you think the sort of prolonged isolation might lead to, so Sabah, you talked a little bit about people taking up risky behaviors, and but also, is it likely that there might be sort of, do you think that this might lead to some sort of antisocial elements in a sense, this kind of effectively, I don't know, sort of taking people away from socializing in a sense? Do you think there's a potential for it being antisocial?
Personally, I don't see a greater risk, by being in the, like by being in this like lockdown and an enforced kind of isolation, a greater risk of antisocial behavior, which I think is a certain kind of mental health term, like it has a certain valence in clinical psychology.
Sure.
I don't see that as necessarily being impacted by isolation. But yeah, I think really one problem is that we don't know what is going to emerge when the lockdown is like, opens up more than what it already has. And I just think in my prediction, I don't see more antisocial behavior because of it, but I do see more like mental health implications and more health implications because of it.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the things that maybe sort of related, the sort of where you're seeing this lack of care of other people, where you hear about people with symptoms potentially moving about in public without informing, say, other people, or without sort of being worried equally about caring for the fact that you might be transmitting the virus. That, in a sense, is an antisocial behavior, right? There's a sort of tremendous lack of civic sense in that kind of, and a tremendous lack of consideration. So whether this is something that's likely to build over time, given that you're sort of, kept away from people in that sense. Great, okay. One of the other things that came up, and I think this is really interesting and probably neither of you covered, but I think, so obviously children are as stuck at home as the rest of us. And I sort of live in a block of flats, and for the first time I've seen sort of children skipping on balconies and things, which is, so one thing is how you might actually want to explain this to children, and how people cope with children who are finding, how people help children cope and how they cope, because a lot of children might be acting out at this time because they're stuck at home, they can't see their friends, they can't do a lot of things that they normally do. So how you might, do you have any suggestions for sort of dealing with children at this time?
I think it is very tricky. I have already seen that there have been a lot of material construction, creation around how to talk about this to children, like from like stories to like children's books to audio recordings, ways in, to use play materials to kind of talk to especially younger children about both what it means, what the pandemic means, and the dangers of it. So I think definitely to be able to speak to children at their level is something that child psychologists have been using as a strategy, and the materials that they've been using are materials that use play, that use the imagination of the child to speak to them. So I think that is something then, we may have to do even without, the formal training, means, at home. I think that for children, like understanding what the pandemic means is, I mean, they must be feeling the tension, the stress of it, even the confinement of it. And I think if anything, child psychology shows us that children are far more perceptive than we give them credit for. So for instance, to use their own observations to talk to them would be something, because they would have sensed what is happening. And so to use their own powers of perception to talk to them might help in starting these conversations and keeping them going.
Yeah, to add to what Sabah said, I think even some of the ways in which we can actually help children is by encouraging them to draw. So I think a lot of times children project their unconscious thoughts, feelings, and emotions onto the drawing. So that's one way through which I think it could also be possible.
Yeah. Great. So sort of effectively sort of getting them to express themselves, sort of creative output. Great. So Ninad, I know you talked quite a bit about ways in which we could mitigate sort of effects. Again, I'm just coming back to that again. And I think this sort of touches on both your areas of expertise in a sense, because someone's actually talked about so the sort of role of religion and the role of prayers, for instance. Is that something, what do you think the role it might play in helping people cope with the situation?
So when it comes to the role of religion, we talk about two forms of religious coping. there is something called intrinsic religious coping and there is something called extrinsic religious coping. So in the context of extrinsic religious coping, we are talking about when you choose to be a part of religious denomination or congregation because you're driven by certain ulterior motives, for maybe like, for example, could be like, to have that strong sense of acceptance by the in-group. Or when you talk about intrinsic religious coping, it's about the need to get in touch with oneself. So it kind of moves towards spirituality. So again, that way in which you use religion actually makes a difference at this point in time. So I think intrinsic religious coping, wherein you're more leaning towards spirituality or spiritual aspects, could be one way through which you would be able to find a sense of meaning in life. And I think if we look at it, meaninglessness is something which we talked about as one of the dimensions of alienation, right? So this is something which can potentially, like, help reduce a sense of alienation. So to find that, to actually get it, so when you use religion to get in touch with your own spiritual self, I think that would play a very critical role, more than being a part of, like, trying to be a part of like a larger religious congregation or a setup.
Sabah, is there anything you'd like to add?
I think that's fine.
Okay. Great. So another thing is, again, we've sort of touched upon a little bit, and Sabah, you kind of elaborated on this as well, this sort of othering, but I think, like you said, this sort of, the pandemic has thrown up, I guess, divisions and othering that's existed in society in sort of stark relief, so to speak. So one of the things is this sort of urban-rural divide. And there are sort of obviously instances where in rural areas where practicing social distancing might be much harder because social norms actually also might be quite different in sort of rural areas. And sort of potentially, and related to that, potentially support for doing some of these kinds of, for sort of actual physical distancing might be limited in these kind of areas. Can you sort of see an urban-rural sort of dynamic to this? Is there something that you see will sort of change? I mean, because this is one, where sort of rural India is very often come to the rescue of urban India, I think, at one of these times. But do you see how sort of norms might vary across different sort of urban and rural locations, for instance?
Okay, so I think that I think that's a very interesting question to think about how norms might be different in urban and rural contexts. I think, like, actually the whole concept of proxemics that was coming up in Edward Hall was actually to talk about space as a cultural artifact, so the ways in which, then our notions of what is an intimate space or a social space, a social distance changes according to context, right? So what is considered what is considered like an invasion of intimate space in one region might not be considered in another one. And I think that would be something that we could look at in the urban-rural divide in India. But I think this is something we'd have to actually, we'd have to look at, we'll have to go step out of our houses, and look at how this happens, what is considered safe, what is considered unsafe, what is considered appropriate or inappropriate. I mean, just at this point, I could only say that there is a high chance that there is a difference, and that in urban settings with the kind of, the ways in which our cities are planned, keeping people in very congested areas, keeping them together, would also invites a lot of suspicion, of anybody who's coming close. So I think that is something that, at least I think in the urban context. I think in the rural context, I'll have to think more, and perhaps I'll come back and write about it in the future.
Great. And then I think we have a little spot of sort of, the millennials and how they might be different for some reason. So I think one of the attendees suggests that maybe the current generation, I'm not sure who all this encompasses, but they might be sort of they're sort of a lot more virtually connected, obviously a lot more sort of savvy with sort of using online fora and sort of other ways to keep in touch with people. So what one of the attendees suggested is, do you think this form of sort of physical distancing or social distancing, where you can't literally physically see people, might have less of an impact on that generation?
On the millennial generation?
Well, it's the question says today's generation. I maybe wrongly punted it to the millennials. I don't know. Today's generation.
I think no, it wouldn't.
Right.
Also, because of the ways in which I have, like, you know, in my talk that I have formulated about, you know, the need for proximity to create and the need to meet the other and confront the other. I was imagining that as to be a face-to-face contact. Yes, of course, like the world is changing, and like our virtual selves meet anonymous others, and that is something, you know, like what it means to be a digital native, you know, is something we need to study. I think we are in a fortunate position that very soon we are going to get our students are going to come back to campus, and perhaps they'll be able to tell us what it means to be like a digital native, you know, to live in virtual worlds and be comfortable there and to interact with people they may not see. I just think that at least psychological theory hasn't kept up with that. I don't feel very confident in thinking that something has changed at the level of the psyche. You know, something has changed in our psychological makeup, even with the advances of the internet. But we would have to wait for younger people to tell us what that, like, you know, if change has happened and how do they theorize that.
So that actual face-to-face interaction still remains, to your mind at least, not replaceable by sort of WhatsApp or TikTok or whatever it is that people are doing, the cool people are doing. Great. I think we're sort of nearing the end of our time now. And I'd like to thank Sabah and Anad very much for a very stimulating discussion, and all our attendees for some really excellent questions. I think that's really been great. So thank you very much. I would also like to advertise our next ConneXions webinar, which is on the 27th of June. Our speaker is Dr. Daniel Smith from the Kelley School of Business, who's going to talk to us about identifying new ways to generate revenue. I hope you can join us. Thank you once again.